Local issues were the most significant reasons for rebellion in the reign of Henry VII. Assess the validity of this view. This is a very interesting question, and it probably would throw a lot of people off, when really it's actually really quite an easy one to go through. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, again, is to write out our introduction. I'll write out our introduction. And so, really, what we've got in this essay question is a little bit of interesting language that we can use. So, we're asked if local issues were the most significant reasons for rebellion. So you could definitely, if you wanted to be picky about the language, you could definitely argue, yes, they might have been significant, however, they weren't the most significant. For example, this thing was most significant, X, Y, Z, evidence for why that it isn't most significant, for example, okay? So we could go down that route. And our introduction, we have to outline it. So we outline this in our introduction. So we say what we're going to do. So we say what we're going to write. What we're going to argue, shall we say. We are going to argue. Okay. So we're going to argue for this, and this. And then our paragraphs. Again, I think probably about 3 paragraphs makes sense. It's generally, if you have time for 4 and you've got the knowledge to slip in a 4th paragraph, go for it. But try to focus on 3. So 3 paragraphs. And then when it comes to how we structure the paragraphs, again, you can talk about it. You can do it in 2 different ways, two main different ways. You can talk about it in the sort of paragraph 1. We could talk about the local issues and rebellions from 1485 to 1490, for example, and then say 1490 to 1500. And then 3rd paragraph, 1500 to 1509. Bear in mind, it's asking during the reign of Henry VIII. So what this is really asking is, local issues were the most significant reasons for rebellion in the years 1485 to 1509. Okay, that's what it's asking. It's asking the reign of Henry VIII. That's one way of doing it, and I don't think this is the question for it. I don't think that this is a good question to really tackle with this structure. You can do it that way, and you can definitely get a good grade from doing it that way. However, I think an easier way of doing it is the traditional way of doing it, which is looking at 3 different topics per paragraph, 3 different examples. And the best thing for this is to just look at 3 different rebellions. You pick 3 different rebellions, and then you argue for and against the proposition that local issues were most significant for that rebellion in each paragraph. It's as simple as that. So let's, for example, you can look at the Yorkshire Rebellion in the first one. Yorkshire Rebellion. That's fine. You then look at the Cornish Rebellion. And you can look at, say, Simnel and Warbeck. Although, I would suggest probably doing it in chronological order. So start with Simnel and Warbeck, since that was earlier in the reign. And the reason why I think this is better than this one is because when it comes to Henry VIII and rebellions, there weren't many rebellions between 1500 and 1509 in this section here. So you can the number of rebellions were definitely heavier, there was a lot more earlier on in his reign than there was later on. By 1500, he had almost entirely consolidated his power, arguably. So you'd struggle to find evidence for later on in his reign, since most of the things that happened were earlier on in his reign. So splitting it in sort of into timeline is probably not the best way of doing it. You could split it into, say, rather than doing it across his entire reign, you could do, say, 1485 to 1486, or maybe 1487, the rebellions that happened then, and then 1487 to 1490, and then the third one 1490 to 1500. You don't have to cover you don't have to cover every single inch of his reign, because that would be sufficient enough to cover most of the rebellions that happened. So you could technically do it like that. I still would recommend doing it this way, but that's still a good idea. You can do it like that. So what are the arguments for and arguments against? So let's have a look at arguments for first of all. Let's get into some actual specific evidence. So arguments for. Oh, there we go. And so really, let's talk about the Yorkshire Rebellion. So the Yorkshire Rebellion is definitely definitely an example of a local issue caused by a raising of a subsidy to provide for the assistance of to Brittany. Okay, so basically raising taxes to pay for war. I guess arguably you could argue against this by saying that the taxes were raised because of having to pay for war. So to bring it back to its logical conclusion, the Yorkshire Rebellion wouldn't have happened if Henry didn't have to pay for a war, arguably making it foreign policy causing this rebellion. That's a good way of looking at it. You can definitely trace it back. Yes, taxes were a local issue, and yes, that is what ultimately caused the Yorkshire Rebellion. But the reason for the taxes being raised was to pay for Brittany, okay, to assist Brittany. So you can look at it like that. So you can say, we have assisting Brittany. That costs money, which means one must have to. That's awful. That's the worst thing I've ever seen. There we go. So that costs money. Thus, they have to raise taxes. And the raising of taxes ultimately caused the Yorkshire Rebellion. Okay, so tracing it back, if we trace it back, Yorkshire Rebellion caused by a local issue that was caused by a foreign policy issue. So that's a good way of arguing against the claim that the Yorkshire Rebellion came from local issues. Moving on to the Cornish Rebellion. What caused the Cornish Rebellion? Again, it was in response to the attempt to raise taxation to support the defence against James IV of Scotland. Okay, so this was was caused by raising taxes again to pay for war with Scotland. And again, just like the Yorkshire Rebellion, you could almost argue the same thing. Whenever there's a local issue, the local issue seems to be the raising of taxes caused as a result of a foreign policy objective. Okay, so you have war with Scotland, or defending against Scotland. That's spelt without an L. There we go. War with Scotland costs money. Therefore, Henry VII had to raise taxes to pay for it. Raise taxes, which led to the Cornish Rebellion. And again, you can trace back, just like we did with the Yorkshire Rebellion, and trace it back through local issues all the way back to a foreign policy issue. Okay, that's one way of doing it. Okay, what about arguments against all of this, against it at all? So arguments against. Arguments against. Okay. Well, we've got definitely, you could just talk about Stafford Rebellion, the Stafford Rebellion, the Lovell Rebellion. They're the same. They're from the same rebellion. Lambert Simnel. Okay, Perkin Warbeck. All of these were motivated by dynastic causes, by dynastic issues. Okay, motivated by dynasty. Motivated by dynasty. Okay, and not motivated by local issues. However, we can flip this one on its back again. We can flip it on its head, and we can say that although the main players were motivated by wanting to take over the crown, it was supported by local angry locals. Okay, got local support. Okay, so all of these people got local support. All of these got local support. But then you can flip that one on its head and say that these weren't caused, the local support wasn't caused by local issues, it was caused by disdain for Henry VII being the new king, being a Lancastrian king. Okay, so these were motivated by dynasty as well. You can really argue a lot in this essay. You can go back and forth, which is good because you're covering all the bases. You're coming to a conclusion on one side or the other, definitely, or maybe sitting on the fence a little bit, but you're arguing both sides of the argument, which is brilliant. Okay, so these are the real things that we can look at here. I think if we can stop this from happening, there we go. I think arguably it's probably most convincing to say that local issues were not the most significant reason. They were a significant reason for rebellion, but they weren't the most significant reason, because we can really, any argument that you can bring forward to suggest that they were the most significant reason, I can come at you with evidence against it. Okay, and say that although, for example, with these two, although the main driver was raising taxes, Henry only raised taxes to support his foreign adventures. Okay, so that's a good argument for that side. Okay, so I think to say that they were the most significant reasons for rebellion would be a little bit unconvincing, slightly invalid. So this is one good way which you can argue for and against this essay question.